Hello everyone. Now I know there's already a lot of tutorial videos on YouTube for Kerbal Space Program, but there's not a lot dealing with the enhanced edition of the game which is on the consoles. It's the exact same game that's on the PC, but on the consoles you can't get any mods whatsoever, and you have to use a controller and you can't use a mouse and keyboard. These two things combined can make the game a bit more challenging, but ultimately in the end you do feel a bit more rewarded when you get to do stuff because it is a bit more challenging because you don't have really important mods like MechJeb and things that can make your life a lot easier in the game. To make a rocket, you're going to want to start off in the vehicle assembly building, which is the building that I have shown on screen right here. So when you're making a rocket, one of the important things that you need to know is how much delta V you need to get to the place that you're trying to go to. For this rocket, we're just going to be going to orbit and landing again. So to orbit Kerbal, you need around 3,500 meters a second, give or take, of delta V, depending on how efficient your orbit is. So if you click in on the left stick, it makes the cursor pop up. It makes it a lot easier for highlighting things instead of just selecting them naturally. If you use this button down here, this is the delta V control. So up here, it shows what body you're selecting. You can change it to whatever you want. And you can change if you're looking at sea level, altitude, or vacuum. What this will do is show you how much delta V your rocket currently has when you have fuel and engines put on. Right now, obviously, we have no parts selected, so nothing is showing. So to start, I'm going to use the Mark 1 command pod. And if you hit the X button when you're highlighting a part, it gives you all the options for that part. And at the bottom, you can change the color of them if you want. Now I'm going to use this ship again in the next video to show how to dock once you're in orbit. So in order to do that, you have to use a docking port. And obviously you want to make sure that the two ships that you're docking in space are using the same kind of docking port, or else it's not going to work. Now the command pod already has heat shield kind of built into it. It'll work if you're just coming back from low Kerbal orbit, but if you're trying to return to Kerbal from like interplanetary speed, it's going to be too hot and the ship's going to blow up and you need to put on a heat shield. But like I said, since we're coming back from Kerbal, you don't need a heat shield, so I'm just going to skip that. And we're going to use a decoupler here, which is going to separate the command pod from the rest of the rocket once we're returning home. After that, I'm going to put on some parachutes. It's really important to have those when you're returning home, unless you want your Kerbals to die. I'm going to use 2 of the Mark II radial parachutes. Down here, this symmetry count button shows you how many of the item you're placing. It goes up to 8. And it'll place them evenly apart in symmetry. So I'm just going to place 2 of those on the side. And I'm going to put 4 drogue parachutes up top. These are smaller and they just help the craft slow down before the main parachutes deploy. You don't need all of these parachutes on this smaller command module, but I think it looks more nicer when you have more. So I just like to put more. It's just as long as you have enough to slow down the ship enough so that it doesn't blow up when it hits the ground. After that, I'm going to put on a service bay, and this opens up, and you can open it up while you're in flight. So I use this to store any science materials I'm using if I'm playing in career mode, or anything like RCS and battery power, all that stuff that you don't want to blow up while you're in flight. I'm going to start off by putting in one of the smaller RCS fuel tanks. These are what the little jet thrusters will use once you're in orbit for like fine-tuning your orbit and doing things like docking and stuff. Next, I'm just putting 2 struts inside so I can place some solar panels on that can deploy while we're in flight, and so they won't get hurt by the atmosphere. And when you're placing a part, as you see, when I hover it there first, it's sticking at the bottom. So you can use the D-pad and it will rotate the part depending on which button you hit, and you just keep hitting it until you have it oriented the way you want, and then you can put it on. And on top of those, I'm just adding 2 solar panels that can recharge the battery of the ship if we're staying in orbit for long periods of time. And this command module already, if you bring up the options bar, it already has 50 electric charge in it. So really, we don't need to do any more battery power for what we're doing in this tutorial video, but for the sake of just showing how to build your rocket, I'm going to put them there anyway. And now I'm playing in sandbox mode just to show everyone how the game works. I can make career mode videos too if anyone would be interested, but also in here is where you would put stuff like your thermometer and your atmospheric scanner and things like that, because those are going to give you more science points when you're playing story mode, and that's kind of one of the most important things because you need that to progress and unlock the skill tree. But that's all I'm putting inside there for now, so I'm just going to go ahead and close it off. And I'm going to put a FLT100 fuel tank in under that. Put it on appropriately. And for this engine, I'm using the Terrier engine because this part that you see here, all of this is flying once it's going to be out in the atmosphere, or out in the vacuum of space, sorry. And this engine's pretty good for vacuums. So to check your delta V, you bring up the screen, hit vacuum, and hit show all. And now down in the staging corner, it shows that my delta V is 703 meters a second, which is more than enough for what we need when we're out in orbit. And the delta V the thrust to weight right now is 2.3, and you want that to be around 1.5 because anything higher than that, your ship's going to accelerate really, really fast, and it's going to be harder to control. And when you're going through the atmosphere, it's going to cause more drag on your ship, which is going to end up bad. You'll use more delta V, and your ship could even tear apart from the stress. And anything below a thruster weight of 1, and your ship's not going to move at all unless it's in a vacuum. And then it's still going to move really slow. So to change the thrust to weight, you want to bring up the options menu for the engine, and here's the thrust limiter slider. It starts off at 100, but you can drag it wherever you want. And if you look down at the bottom on the staging screen, when you're dragging it, it'll make the thrust to weight of your ship come down as well. Now the bar does move pretty quick. The sensor is pretty sensitive for the D-stick, but if you hold the left bumper while you're dragging it, it goes into precision mode, and you can drag it a lot slower for things like this, and you want to fine-tune your thrust to weight. So right here I got it at 1.51, and that's really good, so I'm just going to leave it at that. Next, I'm just adding another sepratron down here, or decoupler, sorry. And then you can add a protective shell over the top of your rocket. And what this does is it's going to, if any part of the top of your ship was not aerodynamic, you can build a fairing around it, and it will make the ship a lot more aerodynamic when it comes to getting to orbit. Now the part inside was pretty aerodynamic, but sometimes it just looks better to have one of those on there anyway. Now I'm going to build the ascent stage, which is going to take this unit fully into orbit. You can use multiple stage rockets if you want, but this is a tiny vehicle, so I'm just going to do it in one stage. So for that, I'm going to take one of the Rockomax X200 fuel tanks and a Rockomax X216 fuel tank. And for the engine, we're going to use the Skipper engine. It's a really powerful engine, and it has a really good gimbal value. And what gimbal is the rocket's ability to pivot and turn so it can keep your thrust pointing at the center of mass, because if your thrust is not pointing at the center of mass, your rocket will start to sway and lean and probably even lose control altogether. So right now it's showing that we have 4,000 meters a second delta V, but that's because we still have vacuum selected. So you want to go back up to the delta V screen and hit sea level now and show all. So we have 3,500 meters a second and 1.75 thrust to weight. Now it says we have 3,500 meters a second of delta V at sea level, but as you start going up through the atmosphere, the delta V of your ship is going to increase because you're going through thinner parts of the atmosphere, and depending on the type of engine you're using, it's going to be more efficient. So even though it says we have 3,500 meters a second delta V, we're going to have more because the atmosphere is going to start thinning out and the engine's going to get more efficient. So I'm actually going to take off this bottom fuel tank and add an even smaller one, because already we have more than enough delta V for what we're going to do. So on the bottom instead, I'm just going to add the X208 fuel tank. There you go, and that's going to bring our delta V down to about 3,275, so that's going to be enough to get to orbit. So all we need to do now is hit show all to show our thrust to weight, which is still at 2.2 and is kind of high, so we're going to bring that down to 1.5. Okay, 1.48 is close enough. I'm just going to change the colors on the tank to make everything match. And now you can add fins at the bottom of your rocket for more stability. Some engines don't have much gimbal, or some engines aren't as good as others, so you might want to add tail fins on your rocket to help straighten it out in flight. This particular engine doesn't really need it, like this rocket will be fine. I just sometimes like to add tail fins just for the visual look anyway. And the last thing we're going to want to add is the launch sacks to hold the rocket in place before it takes off, because we do not want it to be taking off directly touching the ground. That would be bad. Now you want to make sure all your staging is good over on the right. It can be bad if something's in the wrong spot and you don't realize that until you're in flight, and then the next thing you know, you hit A to stage and your rocket blows up. Okay, and that's it for building a rocket to orbit. Now we can launch it, and I can show you how to get into orbit around Kerbal. Well, that's it for my first video. I really hope you enjoyed it and maybe even learned something in the process. Please like and subscribe if you did. There will be plenty of more Kerbal videos to come. And my next tutorial will be how to orbit Kerbal and land back at the Space Center. Thanks.